Hey guys, Professor Jacob here with Chapter 1, Week 1 of our summer session linguistics class. Let's go ahead and get started. This is a mini lecture video. I encourage you to read the chapter in detail, take notes, and be sure to watch the other expansion videos posted in the module. Do all that before you take the quiz. It's important to review the information first before you actually jump into that quiz. Let me go ahead and share my screen, and we'll get started with this lecture. This is chapter 1, the origin of language. So I just want to kind of be clear at the outset here. This chapter is not about the history of language, like where did English come from, where did Spanish and all these other languages come from. We will get into that a little bit later in the semester. This chapter really looks at where did language come from altogether? What's its origin? Now, as you know, Professor Cindy Lewis, one of my colleagues, has found a lot of really fun cartoons, which we've shared with you. And you can see this one fits our theme perfectly. Let me ask you, which of the sources or theories of language does this cartoon represent? You tell me. So this chapter, chapter 1, asks us a few questions. Where did language come from? Where did it start? Did it happen all at once, or were there gradual changes along the evolutionary path to lead us to where we are today? Now, chapter 1 starts out with the religious and cultural explanations. We may be familiar with the Judeo-Christian model of the Tower of Babel. Our book brings up the Hindu tradition, where Sarasvati gives humans language. There are numerous examples in religion and myths all around the world that essentially have a divine source for language. But as our book points out, the question as to whether or not humans have this kind of natural language that occurs in them was put to test multiple times throughout history, right? And one most recent example in the 1970s was of a young lady named Jeannie, who was essentially abandoned and abused as a young girl, completely isolated from her infancy all the way until essentially her adulthood. And in that time, because she had no human contact, she never acquired a language. So what does that tell us? There is no essentially natural language that just comes out of us if we're never actually exposed to language itself. We'll talk later about the innate capacity to produce language, but there are important elements for an infant essentially to experience before that innate capacity can kick in. So the divine source is somewhat limited, but still an interesting part of our cultural traditions and something to be respected, right? What's the purpose of language is one question we should ask ourselves. Is the purpose essentially to communicate with each other, to coordinate? Perhaps that is the origin of language. But we also see communication and coordination among other primates and other animals in the animal kingdom who presumably don't have human language, right? What are some advantages to having language? What did that do for us as a species? And then what are the physical characteristics that are involved in producing language? All of these questions are important because they lead us to potential reasons as to how language came about. Now, our book points to possible sources or origins. These are essentially origin theories of language. It's not to say that only one of these is possible. It's not to say that they are mutually exclusive. There could be a combination of them. We just briefly went over the divine source a minute ago. I'll touch on each one of these very quickly, but again, I'll encourage you to go back through the book and read a lot more carefully. The natural sound source essentially was proposed by a guy named Otto Jespersen, who was a Danish linguist. This refers to the sounds we hear in nature, what are often called onomatopoeia sounds. Things like, hoo-hoo, bow wow, ruff ruff, moo, sounds that we hear from animals that we essentially created or brought into our own language system. The poo-poo theory, as Jespersen likes to call it, essentially refers to human emotional sounds, cries of pain, joy, that then became sort of words within a language. But there's a limit to these sounds. They can only take us so far, right? And they don't really account for the ability to put together sentences and all these other complex things that we do in language. The musical source talks about maybe the idea that melody and harmony and rhythm and things like that were precursors to human language. Charles Darwin, the evolutionary scientist, has a famous quote back in 1871 that the book references, where essentially before humans could speak, he postulated, humans charmed each other with music. Now, whether or not that's true, there obviously isn't a great deal of direct evidence for that. There is evidence, however, of the attachment that a baby has to its mother based on the vocal qualities of the mother. So when an infant is born, obviously it doesn't understand words, presumably at that point, but it can detect its own mother's sound quality, musical qualities perhaps of language, and the mother's native tongue, and has a preference for those qualities of sound. Very interesting connection that's been observed in recent studies. So why do we use language? Again, that's one of the questions that we're asked in this chapter. Jesperson points out the idea to communicate in groups, right? To achieve a task, to maybe build a house or some structure, to fend off a predator. He coined the yo-he-ho theory, kind of the Workman song, yo-he-ho, right? So in order for things to get done, people had to communicate. Well, that's a possibility. But again, we observe this among other primates. This may explain the need for language, but it doesn't explain how language came to be. That's where the physical adaptation source theory comes in. As our bodies evolve from walking on, legs and with our hands as other primates do, we started walking upright. Our bodies changed, so our larynx, our throat got straightened out. Our vocal cords moved in a different way. Our mouth and tongue, the tongue is this incredibly important part of language, became smaller essentially, and the mouth became, more refined in its ability to manipulate sound as it comes out of the mouth. The teeth and the lips are much different than other primates. So all these physical changes could have created the human capacity to produce sounds that essentially became language. The tool-making source, again, tries to connect the social aspect to language. But what's interesting here is how it connects to the human brain. And we'll get deeper into the human brain in chapter 12. But essentially what's been found here is that the aspects of the human brain that allow for movement of the hands, to create tools and to use tools, those motor skills are essentially housed in the same place in the brain as language function. And so the ability to move the muscles of the jaw and to produce sounds in the throat are all kind of housed next to each other. Why is that important? Because the brain is lateralized. Lateralized means it's kind of broken up into separate little functions, such that if one part of the brain gets severely damaged, the rest of the brain can continue to function. It's an incredibly important and unique organ. So because of that sort of, housing of those skills next to each other in the brain, it's an interesting connection. By the way, that is the left hemisphere. I didn't mean to point this way. It is the left hemisphere that controls those aspects of our motor functions and language functions. So the last source that our book talks about is the genetic source, whether or not this is part of our gene makeup, right? The idea that language is innate. And essentially, this is probably the more popular theory these days because genetic science is common, right? That makes sense. But there's also evidence for this in communities of deaf children. So if deaf children, for example, are never, children obviously not able to hear auditory sounds, but if they're put in situations where they need to communicate, deaf children can actually create signs themselves in a way that mimics the process of human language creation, something called creolization, which I'll talk about more in just a quick second. They're also, essentially because sign language exists, it's testament to the human innate capacity to need to communicate and the ability to organize thoughts in a way that becomes language. So, whether or not there's an actual gene that determines our ability to, have language is still in question. That is speculation, but right now scientists are pretty interested in a gene called FOXP2. This FOXP2 gene is considered the language gene in the sense that it could have been that one mutation, perhaps, that gave us all the ability to use language in this way. Not just the physical characteristics, but the ability to put together these sounds, and not just sounds by naming things, but those sounds all together creating phrases with meaning and structuring them in long strings such as sentences, paragraphs, etc., and all the complexity that goes along with language itself. So as you can see, there are lots of different possible sources. I encourage you to go back through the book, read more deeply. Come visit me in office hours if you want to talk a little bit more deeply about some of these. This was just a quick review. Try to keep these videos under 12 to 15 minutes. So some things to think about as you're reading. For each source in the textbook, what are the arguments for and against each source? What is the evidence to support or disprove the source? Now, just a deeper dive beyond this chapter. Sometimes people ask in class around this time of the semester, can new languages be created, or are we kind of stuck with the 7,000 languages that we have on the planet today, based on the video that you'll see, the expansion video? Yes, new languages can be created. It is part of that perhaps innate human capacity to communicate and produce language. And there are some examples. I'll give you two real quick. Pidgin languages, for example. Pidgin languages are essentially communications, types of communication among speakers of different languages that are forced to essentially work together or be together or communicate in a way where they don't all share a common tongue, but they're putting together common words, perhaps common sounds, maybe making up words to create a temporary language to solve the time being, right? One example of this is found in history. The transatlantic slave trade, which is, of course, a horrible part of our human history, produced situations where people were taken from their land, put with other people, other languages, other speakers of other languages, forced to work together, essentially. And in that environment, created language themselves. So these pidgins are essentially simplified, non-native contact languages that essentially allow people to get a job done, to communicate and get something done. Properties of pidgin languages include no native speakers. These essentially are created among speakers of other languages. They're the result of contact between two or more languages. They have a small and limited vocabulary, and they're not mutually intelligible with contributing languages. So if I'm, creating a pidgin out of French, Spanish, English, that trade pidgin language won't be mutually understandable with the other languages it came from. But what happens when the children of those pidgin speakers start to hear that pidgin language and use it among themselves? This is a testament to the brain's capacity to acquire language and fill in the gaps of what's necessary to communicate. So pidgin languages often lack detailed grammatical structure. Creole, or languages that essentially come from pidgins, account for those. They make up for those grammatical functions. And there are lots of different examples of these pidgin Creole languages around the world. In Papua New Guinea, for example, there are more than 800 different languages there. And an English-based pidgin developed along the way called Tok Pisin. Talk, think about that. Talk, the verb. Pisin. Pisin actually is a changing of the word fishing. So this language came about among fishermen. So for example, here's a sentence. I won't try to pronounce it, but you can read it in Tok Pisin. In a moment, we'll see a speaker of the language. Essentially, this says, by and by, head belong you, he all right again, right? And that translation would be, your head will soon get well again, right? So we can see parts of English, right? But also perhaps parts of other languages grammatically, phonologically, to produce this new form. This process, once again, is called creolization. Pidgin, that's again that temporary language, gets picked up by the children of the speakers of the pidgin, and the brain fills in all the gaps that are needed to have a full functioning, robust language, and that's called a creole. Lots of creoles exist in the world. Haitian Creole, for example, is one of them. Jamaican Patois, we just learned about Tok Pisin. And again, Tok Pisin is now a language spoken by over 1 million people. Here is an example of a speaker of Tok Pisin. Give it a moment to load. Hopefully this will go. Okay, so I'll link that video. My apologies, it's not going to show up here. I'll link it somewhere else, and we can get deeper into that. One other example of whether or not languages can be created, think about all the languages that we've seen in pop culture in Hollywood. For example, Elvish, Klingon, Dothraki, Na'vi. So these are languages that are created by writers, but they are actually pretty robust languages in themselves with fully functioning grammars and vocabulary and all that good stuff. All right, that was a little extra for you. I hope this first video was helpful. Let me know if you have questions. I'll see you in the next one.